In the fractured hierarchy of the Third Reich, where prestige was often bought with political sycophancy and fanaticism, one figure stood as a cold, intellectual outlier. Among the sea of yes-men and decorated ideological warriors who populated Hitler's high command, this general was a ghost in the machine. He was a man defined not by the swastika on his sleeve, but by the map in his hand and the tactical brilliance in his mind. To the men in the mud, he was a lifeline. To the strategists in London and Washington, he was the most dangerous man in Europe. He was a master of Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare. While other commanders threw divisions into the meat grinder of static attrition, he saw the battlefield as a fluid, living thing. He understood the delicate trinity of war, the friction of logistics, the geometry of terrain, and the fragile psychology of the common soldier. He didn't view his troops as expendable statistics to be traded for a few kilometers of scorched earth. He viewed them as a finite resource that, once spent, could never be recovered. His reputation was such that even the Allied commanders, men like Montgomery and Patton, studied his movements with a mixture of professional dread and quiet admiration. He was a soldier's general, a man who frequented the front mines, not for the cameras of the propaganda ministry, but to smell the cordite and gauge the exhaustion in his men's eyes. However, in the corridors of Berlin, this brilliance was viewed with a squinted, paranoid eye. The Nazi regime did not trust men who thought for themselves. They feared a general who possessed the three things the party could not control: the genuine loyalty of the army, the respect of the international community, and an intellect that saw through the amateurish delusions of the Führer. He was the best general Germany had, and for that very reason, he was the one they could least afford to keep. As the tide of the war began to turn and the optimistic maps of 1941 were replaced by the defensive nightmares of 1943 and 44, the general's value skyrocketed. On multiple occasions, through sheer tactical genius, he managed to stitch together a collapsing front. He performed what the German press called miracles of the defensive, delaying the inevitable collapse and frustrating the Soviet steamroller in the east. But every time he won a battle that seemed lost, he inadvertently drove a wedge between himself and the chancellery. His victories were an uncomfortable paradox for the regime. On one hand, Hitler needed him to keep the enemy at bay. On the other, each success reinforced a truth that the Nazi leadership found intolerable. The war was being won by professional skill, not by National Socialist will. The general proved time and again that the war could be fought and should be fought differently. He demonstrated that tactical withdrawals, the preservation of armor, and the refusal to engage in suicidal stands were the only things keeping Germany from total annihilation. This made him a threat to the very core of the Nazi mythos. The regime preached blind obedience, Kadavergehorsam, and the idea that a German soldier never retreats. The general, by retreating and then counterattacking with devastating precision, made the Führer's hold at all costs orders look like the amateurish ramblings of a madman. He wasn't just defeating the Red Army, he was unintentionally debunking the infallibility of Adolf Hitler. In a totalitarian state, being right when the leader is wrong is a death sentence. The friction finally sparked into an open flame during a winter campaign where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of an entire army group. The order from the Wolf's Lair was clear, typed in the cold, uncompromising font of the OKW. Not one step back. Every man is to stand or die where he is. It was a death warrant for 50,000 men. The general looked at the map, seeing the Soviet pincer movements closing in like the jaws of a trap. He knew that to stay was to be erased. For the first time, he didn't just question the order, he ignored it. Without seeking permission and knowing that his communications were likely being monitored by the Gestapo, he issued his own command. He ordered a massive, coordinated withdrawal under the cover of a blizzard. He pulled his troops back 20 miles to a ridgeline that offered natural defensive advantages, a position that allowed his artillery to sweep the valley and his panzers to strike the enemy's overextended flanks. The move worked brilliantly. The Soviet advance hit the empty pocket, lost momentum, and was shattered by the general's counterstrike. Tens of thousands of German lives were saved, and the front was stabilized for another 6 months. But in the twisted logic of Berlin, the strategic success was irrelevant. The general had committed the ultimate sin of the professional soldier. He had prioritized the lives of his men over the literal word of the Führer. He had proven that disobedience was the path to victory. To the men in the trenches, he was a savior. To the regime, he had officially become a rebel. The clock had begun to tick, and the general knew that while he might have saved his army, he had almost certainly forfeited his life. As 1944 progressed, the atmosphere in Germany grew thick with the scent of conspiracy. The July plot, the attempt by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb, sent the regime into a hysterical bloodlust. Though the general was a professional soldier and not a politician, his name began to appear in the frantic, tortured confessions extracted by the Gestapo in the basement of Prince Albertstrasse. Whether or not he was an active member of the resistance is a question that historians still debate, but his guilt in the eyes of the Nazis was already established by his character. He was guilty by intellect. He was the kind of man who would have supported a more rational government. In the wake of the failed coup, Hitler no longer cared about tactical brilliance. He wanted loyalty sealed in blood. The general was recalled from the front, stripped of his command, and placed under honorary house arrest. But honor in the Third Reich was a fleeting thing. The regime knew they couldn't give him a public trial. He was too popular with the troops, and a trial would expose the very strategic disagreements they wanted to hide. Instead, they sent 2 men in a black car. They offered him a choice that was no choice at all. A quiet death by his own hand to protect his family and his staff from the People's Court, or a public execution that would see everyone he loved dragged into the abyss with him. In the windowless offices of the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, a dossier was growing. It wasn't bound in the leather of a hero's biography, but in the thin gray paper of a traitor's indictment. As the general moved across the Eastern Front, he was accompanied not just by his loyal aides, but by the invisible cold eyes of the SS Security Service. They were recording every word spoken in the map rooms, every sigh during a late-night radio briefing, and every sharp rebuttal given to a visiting party official. The reports circulating through Berlin began to paint a picture of a man who had become a direct threat to the ideological purity of the war. The general had committed the ultimate sin of the professional soldier. He had begun to question the political necessity of atrocity. He questioned the executions of commissars and civilians that followed in the wake of the advancing army, arguing not just from a place of morality, but from a place of cold, hard logic, arguing that such brutality only hardened the enemy's resolve and made the war unwinnable. He criticized the impossible timetables dictated by Berlin, which ignored the reality of the Russian mud and the freezing temperatures that turned oil into jelly. Worst of all, he spoke openly about the reality at the front, a reality of dwindling fuel, shattered divisions, and a Soviet industrial machine that was outproducing Germany 5-1. This was a reality that Adolf Hitler had long since retreated from, preferring the company of sycophants who promised him final victory through the sheer power of will. But the most dangerous line in the Gestapo dossier didn't concern the general's words to his superiors, it concerned his influence over his subordinates. Junior officers, the captains and majors who were actually leading men into the fire, had begun to listen to the general more than they listened to Berlin. They saw in him a leader who understood the value of their lives, whereas the orders from the chancellery treated them as fuel for a dying fire. In the eyes of the Reich, the the general wasn't just a dissident, he was the potential head of a military mutiny. He was becoming a rival center of power, and in a totalitarian state, power is a zero-sum game. When the end finally came, it wasn't marked by a dramatic confrontation or a formal reading of charges in a courtroom. There are no trial records to be found in the Federal Archives of Germany, no transcripts of a defense, and no signatures of a presiding judge. This is because no real trial ever occurred. In the final months of the Reich, the law had been replaced by the Führer principle. Whatever the leader willed was legal. The charges leveled against him in the secret corridors of the OKW, Armed Forces High Command, were kept vague by design. There was no need for specific evidence of a plot or a physical act of sabotage. Instead, they used the catch-all vocabulary of the dying regime. They accused him of defeatism, the crime of accurately predicting that the war was being lost. They accused him of a lack of faith in the ultimate victory of the German spirit. And most pointedly, they accused him of undermining morale by refusing to send his men into certain pointless slaughter. In the Third Reich, these words were not mere criticisms, they were a death sentence. To suggest that a battle was lost was to betray the Führer. To suggest that an order was suicidal was to prove oneself a coward. The general's brilliance, once his greatest asset, was now presented as proof of his treachery. They argued that because he was so intelligent, his lack of faith was a conscious choice to fail. He had committed the crime of being a realist in a kingdom of ghosts and delusions. The removal of the general was a masterclass in the night and fog tactics that had become the hallmark of the SS. There was no public arrest, no dramatic scene at the front lines that might have sparked a revolt among his loyal troops. Such a move would have been too risky. The general was still a hero to the men in the trenches. Instead, the regime waited for a moment of quiet. One night, while he was at a rear area headquarters for a supposed strategy consultation, a black car arrived. There were no sirens, no shouting. He was politely but firmly informed that he was being taken to a secure location for clarification of certain administrative matters. He was removed from his quarters, his personal sidearm was taken for safekeeping, and he was driven away into the dark. Officially, the word given to his staff the next morning was that the general had been reassigned to a secret research project in the interior of the Reich. Unofficially, his name vanished from operational reports overnight. Orders that were supposed to bear his signature were replaced by the blunt, unimaginative lines of party favorites. It was as if he had never existed, a literal damnatio memoriae in the midst of a world war. The silence lasted for weeks. His wife, waiting in their home in Bavaria, received no letters, no phone calls, and no information from the Ministry of Defense. Then a single sealed notice arrived via a stone-faced courier. It contained no condolences, only the cold statement of fact. Her husband had been executed by firing squad for high treason against the German people. The general who had saved tens of thousands of lives by refusing a suicidal order was killed by the very state he had served. His brilliance was extinguished not by an enemy shell, but by a bullet from his own side. He was the man who won the battles but lost the war against the madness of his own leaders. Even today, his name is spoken in the halls of military academies as a warning that the most difficult battle a soldier ever faces is the one where he has to choose between the orders of his government and the dictates of his conscience. When the news of the general's sudden passing began to ripple through the officer corps, it did not trigger a mutiny or a chorus of public outcries. Instead, it produced a silence that was more profound and more terrifying than any protest. In the mess halls of the Eastern Front and the planning rooms of the West, men who had spent their lives studying the art of command looked at each other and said nothing. This silence was not born of agreement. Every veteran officer knew that the cerebral hemorrhage reported in the state newspapers was a transparent lie. They knew the general was healthy, sharp, and more vital than the crumbling regime he served. They understood the message written between the lines of the obituary. If the most capable mind in the Wehrmacht could be erased like a typo in a ledger, then no one was safe. The execution acted as a chemical stabilizer, freezing the initiative of the German military. From that moment on, the general staff culture, a tradition that dated back to Frederick the Great and emphasized Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics where officers were encouraged to use their own judgment, was dead. Strategy was replaced by a rigid, hollow obedience. Commanders who once would have argued for a tactical retreat to save their divisions now simply stared at their maps and waited for orders from a bunker hundreds of miles away. They had learned the lethal lesson of the general's fate. In the Third Reich, it was safer to be defeated while following the Führer's orders than to be victorious while defying them. The army had been decapitated of its intellect, leaving only the reflex of the machine. The strategic consequences of the general's death were almost immediate. In the months following his execution, the German casualty rates on the Eastern Front didn't just rise, they spiked into a vertical line. Without his elastic defense and his ability to read the rhythm of Soviet movements, the German lines became brittle and static. Retreats that once would have been orderly, fighting withdrawals turned into panicked routes. Entire divisions, comprising tens of thousands of seasoned veterans, were sacrificed on the altar of ideology. They were ordered to hold fortress cities that had no strategic value simply because Hitler refused to concede territory. Because there was no longer a general with the stature or the courage to say no, these units were encircled and ground into the frozen earth. Historians would later look at the maps of 1944 and 1945 and conclude that the execution of the general was the moment the German military lost its ability to adapt. A war is a living, breathing contest of wills, and by killing its most realistic mind, the regime had effectively blinded itself. They had traded competence for a fanatical, blind loyalty that could produce nothing but a more spectacular ruin. The regime hadn't just executed a man, it had executed the very concept of strategic survival. For years after the smoke had cleared from the ruins of Berlin, the general story remained a fragmented mystery, obscured by the chaos of the post-war era and the deliberate shredding of documents by the fleeing SS. It was only when the Allied Operation Paperclip and subsequent archival declassifications began to piece together the secret history of the OKW that the full scope of the tragedy emerged. Researchers found field reports from the front lines that read like a lost masterclass in warfare. They found glowing assessments from their peers, and even more tellingly, they found the captured dossiers of the Allied intelligence services. In the files of the British MI6 and the American OSS, the general was consistently referred to as Germany's most dangerous mind. The Allies didn't fear him because he was a fanatic, they feared him because he was a realist. They knew that as long as he was in command, the war would be longer, costlier, and harder to win. They were shocked to learn that the Nazis had done their work for them. In the end, the regime killed him for the same reason it ultimately lost the war. It chose loyalty over truth. It chose the comforting lies of a madman over the uncomfortable realities of a genius. The general's unmarked grave, if one even exists, stands as a monument to the ultimate failure of totalitarianism.